We will go ahead and get started. If everybody can take a seat and be ready, we'll start with our panel. I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning, and I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. Starting to my right is Martin Barron, Executive Editor of the Washington Post. Next to him, Sally Busby, Associated Press, Senior Vice President. Next is David Chavrin, President of Media Alliance. And finally, Craig Foreman, CEO of McClatchy. What does the future of news look like in the United States? Let's say it's a tough question, and one that we all spend a lot of time and a lot of probably sleepless hours mulling over. 2019 is expected to be the first year in history where digital ad spending will outpace traditional media ad spending. Research shows companies will be spending more than $129 billion on digital advertising in 2019, and it's predicted to balloon to more than $172 billion by 2021. There are two reasons, really, why digital media companies aren't able to sustain themselves online: Facebook and Google. Google and Facebook took in about 58% of all digital advertising in 2018, with Amazon coming in a close third with about 4%. That leaves about 38% for every other online company. One recent forecast suggested the major metro dailies had 14 to 18 months to get rid of legacy costs of print before financial collapse. Among the higher profile initiatives out there to address the issues are funded journalism and the introduction of a safe harbor bill in Congress this past April that would explore recompensation of media for content that feeds the online behemoths. There are also other issues out there, trust, public trust, which pretty much mirrors the President Trump's polls. About 55% trust the media and 40% don't. What we've got to do is find ways to not only make our newspapers fiscally viable, but also to increase the public trust, or increase the public trust numbers out there. I'd like to ask our panel to maybe just each start with perhaps with you, Martin, about and give some of your thoughts, initial thoughts on the threats out there and what can be done and what is being done.
Okay. Well, do we have questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Look, there are multiple threats against our industry, which I think you're all familiar with. Obviously, there are the financial pressures. The digital nature of news has created huge threats to the financial foundation for the industry. As mentioned, the tech platforms are absorbing the vast majority of the advertising revenue. But I think the biggest threat is the challenge to the very idea of objective truth, which is taking place not only in this country, but in other countries as well. And that I think the public is generally confused about what is reality and what's not reality, and how do you judge what's true and what's false. And I think that represents by far the biggest threat to news and to journalism in this country and elsewhere as well. And that's something that I think that we really have to address through a variety of methods that we can talk about later, I guess, in terms of how we might restore trust in news organizations.
I think that's all exactly right. I would sort of call out in particular two things. I think that the financial situation of the industry, which is affecting everyone and globally, because a lot of the same trends that obviously are happening in the US are happening at different levels across the world. But local news is obviously under particular stress in the United States and in many places. And I do think that that is, I'm sure Craig and others will talk more in depth about this. I do think that that is a very dangerous thing for democracy, for any political, obviously any political system that you have in any country. And so the importance of coverage, not just on the coasts of a country, but also in small towns or even regional centers across a country like the US, I think is something that is very dangerous for us. I think that Marty is right that the essential question of factual journalism is what is under attack, and we see that very clearly in the United States. I just actually coincidentally got back from a trip to India, and I would say that one of the things that has me the most worried is the impact of some of the misinformation campaigns and attacks on media across the globe. So for example, we are all very interested in what is happening in the United States, but some of the same trends are happening in countries that may have less resilience to fight back against them. And so for example, if we have leaders in the United States who attack free media, that's a very dangerous issue, but we can probably get through it. I think what is more worrisome is the sort of Pandora's box that this is opening up across the world, especially in countries that may not have the types of institutions that can fight back against this long term. And in a place like India, and we can talk about this a little bit more, I was quite stunned at the level of intimidation of the media. So I think by a political leader. And I think that's something that we all need to worry about.
Thank you. New distribution systems challenge business models, and we're not the first to suffer this. With the advent of radio and then movies and then television, music lost control of their distribution systems. And over a multi-decade period in the early part of the 20th century, they developed these collective licensing regimes to essentially collect value everywhere value was received. A similar thing happened with television content and cable distribution in the 80s and 90s. There was a huge renegotiation over how content was to be compensated with carriage fees here in the US and other things. But there was long and hard and brutal debates, but also necessary ones, right? We're in the early stages of understanding what the new distribution compensation model is for news content, but the only problem is we don't have 30 years to figure it out. The ASCAP, the Music Licensing Organization, was formed in 1914, and they finally came to an agreement with the federal government in 1941. Over that span of time, we're going to lose most of the local journalism in the United States by far. So we need to have very immediate conversations about what the compensation model looks like for news in the digital era. Because frankly, today, among my membership, you have declining print circulation, exploding, by the way, digital audience. The digital audience is fantastic. But that declining print business almost everywhere still makes much more money than that exploding digital audience. The good thing is it's a solvable problem. There are a lot of difficult problems in the world, and this one isn't insolvable. There's plenty of good content and money to go around, but we do need to solve it and get to the next stage for the industry.
Good morning. I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts on solutions, but before I do, I'd like to mention that we're here at the 75th anniversary of this organization devoted to press freedom in many countries where the United States for many years thought that it actually had no worries with regard to press freedom. And I think it's an important thing for us to remember what this organization was created for 75 years ago. And I'm going to make a call out to my predecessor on the board of the McClatchy Company, who was actually chair of our board, Jim McClatchy, who was a former president of this organization, and his spouse, Susan, who continues to this day to be a very active supporter of IAPA, and I've been very impressed by the people that I've had a chance to meet for the first time. I think part of the solution reflects our communities, and I also want to mention Mindy Marquez, who is the president and the editor-in-chief of the Miami Herald, and a lifetime Miami Herald dedicated journalist and now business person. And I also want to mention Kristen Roberts, our vice president of news, who lives in Miami and who leads as one of the 5 female leaders of our 6-person executive news team, a highly diverse, highly committed to gender diversity organization, which has to be part of the solution. We cannot simply be looking at people who just look like ourselves in order to get to the 2 things that in the online world actually work. Be essential and make sure that your products are constantly putting the customer first. I'll make one point of reference because there's someone on this panel who works for someone who in 10 minutes makes more money than I or anybody else in this room makes. And Jeff Bezos, with his digital products at Amazon 20 years ago, showed the world that if you save users time, you save them money and delight them in some ways, your digital products will succeed. I think for too long our industry, and I started out as a foreign correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, then a bureau chief in Tokyo before I ran a digital business before I was recruited to Silicon Valley at the dawn of the internet, and I spent most of the last 22 years in Silicon Valley. I think most of us took too long to see this challenge, and we have to look at ourselves and our responsibility for that. And as the panel has pointed out, time is not on our side. Our biggest enemy is time. And the amount of time that we spend discussing among ourselves the reasons is time we never get back for being essential to our customers and figuring out how to put the customers first in a digital organization, which is one of the reasons why digital audience at McClatchy has tripled in the past 2 years, and paid digital subscribers are now in the hundreds of thousands. And I think, Marty, while you're a private company, you're now over 1 million. This is part of the path that we all have to seek in a world where, like King Canute, we cannot make the tide go back. We have to recognize that if you're under the age of 40, you've never known a world without broadband. If you're under the age of 30, you've never known a world without a powerful device in your hand that can get anything you want, when you want it, how you want it, in the manner that you want it. And then finally, if you're in your early 20s, that's always been a rich experience on an iPhone or an Android device. And we just know from our own lives that those never leave your grasp.
Thanks. David, let's start with your topic about new distribution models, business models. So similar to, as you said, music had to undergo this, a similar thing. The TV industry certainly did. What are some of the solutions? What are some of the initiatives out there that are addressing this?
I think if you looked across the industry, people are moving in every direction and experimenting and innovating like crazy. There's a big focus on reader revenue and subscription models, and I think that's a great thing. That's also maybe not a universal model particularly for all local publishers. And you also have to understand about subscription models is that the end point is that some people get the content and some people don't, right? It is by its nature has to be sustainable, has to exclude some level of the readership. I think a number of publishers are trying to expand their businesses in terms of events and commerce and a number of different products, and I think those are all great initiatives. You are faced with this challenge, though, that even the most digital-forward organizations are having a difficult time surviving, and there are a number of digital native news organizations that do great journalism that are not sustaining themselves. And then people come back to a couple of pots of money. Sometimes you'll hear commentary of, well, the government has to start writing checks to publishers, or tax credits that are essentially similar. I think that's a challenging model in the U.S., and I also think it's a challenging model for journalism, but I'll let folks on the editorial side address that. There's sort of the philanthropy, rich guys are going to save journalism view. And by the way, I have a number of my members who are wealthy benefactors, owners who do great stuff, but you have to look at what the generalized model is for a whole industry, and I'm not sure there's enough rich people around to sustain a whole system of local journalism. So we come back to the role that is additional pot, not exclusive, not the only answer, but the additional thing that needs to be looked at is the role that the platforms play as the distributors of the content, the place where most people go to get their content online. These organizations have great and innovative advertising businesses. They benefit a lot from having news content that drives engagement. And at the end of the day, it's okay to ask that they participate economically and return some of the value back to news publishing that matters so much to all of us. News is an interesting kind of content. It's really important. And that sounds silly, but what I mean by that is, the line I always use is nobody asked for congressional hearings about fake cat videos, okay? It is critical to our civic society, and it's not just an industry that can be disrupted and evaporate, and we'll have to wait to see what comes next. We need to have a serious conversation about returning value from all these sources to sustain it, because otherwise we won't have a civic society to worry about. So.
Thank you. So Sally, with the shift there must be a shift in AP's business model with the reduction in the number of newspapers. What are some of the things that y'all are looking at, and specifically, have you been involved with the Safe Harbor Act talks?
Yeah, obviously, our revenue comes from news organizations. And so when because we license content to news organizations. And so when news organizations face trouble, obviously that affects us. And I think we're lucky in the sense that we have customers all across the globe, but I think, not just because it's our mission, but also because it's our business, we care very deeply what happens to news organizations in the US and news organizations all across the world. And I think some of the same trends that we're seeing in the United States are starting, obviously, to ripple across the world. And so if you go to Europe and you talk to what seems like a very stable state broadcaster, their audience is quite old. And a lot of the young people in their country are starting to consume news on smartphones. So I don't think it's any different. I think it is just what the pace of change is and that sort of things. So a couple things. I think what David said is very smart. There's probably not enough rich guys in the world to go around to save the business models of journalism. I do think that some of the philanthropy or some of the investment is helping create some space for some experimentation so that we can figure out what does work in a digital environment and what does work for young audiences. We have very carefully, with a very rigorous standards thing in place, taken a little bit of grant money to boost up some coverage areas that it would be very difficult for us to really explore as much as we want with our news budget. And so, for example, we have some grant funding that is helping us do some deeper health and science coverage than we would be able to do just with our normal news budget. That was, we have gone through a rigorous and ongoing process to make sure that that does not hurt our independence. And it was something that really required a lot of internal conversation before we were comfortable with it, and a lot of conversation with our stakeholders. It's very important to me that that grant money not just go to hire a couple health and science writers in the United States, but also, for example, we're hiring one of them in Jakarta and one of them in Delhi, where I just was. That was one of the reasons that I went there, because I do want to make sure that it helps our global news organization and impacts and helps all of our customers and members. I think the other thing is what we're trying to do. I mean, the main thing that we're trying to do is, this is what we say in the AP. In our standards, in our accuracy, and our mission, we are as old-fashioned as we can possibly be. We are not changing our mission, which is accurate, credible journalism. But in the way that we present that journalism for whatever platform, we are completely agnostic and try to be as modern-leaning as possible. And that means in a period of a lot of experimentation where each one of our customers and members is experimenting in some different way, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of churn, because what we're trying to do is make sure that we present our accurate journalism in whatever form they need. So the best example I can give on this is when I was Washington bureau chief during the last presidential election. And on election night, we had people who wanted us to present election night in a very traditionally written way, and we wanted people to, that our customers who wanted it in little bursts of information very fast. And so sometimes we feel a little bit like we're straddling traditional media and modern-looking media and trying to meet the needs of both, and that's just our challenge. But to me, the most important thing is to just be as agnostic as possible in terms of how people consume news, but not be agnostic on holding on to the values and the mission.
What experience have you had with the Safe Harbor bill?
With what?
With the Safe Harbor bill in Congress? The Safe Harbor bill is the real name for it is Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. It was. Without talking about anything specific, I think we feel that it is important that I think it is my personal feeling, and I think the AP's feeling, is that the business models of journalism have to stand up in a commercial world, right? I don't think we feel comfortable with government subsidies of journalism. Obviously, they happen across the world, and we play all across the world. I think that, probably the best thing for journalism is to figure out free market solutions that will sustain journalism. So we are quite open to the idea that we have to make sense of philanthropy. I think we are less comfortable with, the only thing we really advocate for in any sort of government context is just, media access. Other than that, we're pretty hands-off and conservative. Martin, what are some of your answers for the questions the issues you brought up about objective truth and what's real and what's fake, and how do we get that message out?
Sure. Well, I think that there are several things that we can do. It's not an easy challenge. I think that we need to be much more transparent as a profession. We need to be more transparent about how we go about our work, show documents whenever we can, provide the recordings of interviews whenever we can, provide any kind of information that substantiates the reporting that we've done. Be clear about how many sources we've talked to, you name it, across the board. Number two is I think we need to be more transparent about who we are. I think there are misconceptions among the public, certainly here in the United States, about the people who work in journalism, particularly at the largest institutions. There's a perception that we come strictly from sort of so-called elite backgrounds, that we only went to so-called elite schools, and that's just not the case. We have people in our newsroom who have served in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have people who grew up on farms. We have people who went to evangelical colleges. We have people who grew up in very poor circumstances. And so I think it's important that we make clear who we are and that we're very much a reflection of the country as a whole. And then finally, and I think probably most important, is that we need to write about people in every corner of our country. And we need to show them that we understand the issues that they're facing in their daily lives. They need to see themselves reflected in our journalism. They need to recognize that we're an empathetic organization, that we're a listening organization, that we hear them, that we understand them, And it's important that we do that on a regular basis, not strictly on an occasional basis. So those are some of the ways that I think that we can restore confidence from the public. I don't think that we're ever going to have everybody thinking that they deserve our confidence, that we deserve their trust, because that's never been the case. But I think that we have actually seen over the last couple of years here in the United States a modest increase in trust in the press. Now it's highly polarized, a huge increase among Democrats, and virtually no increase among Republicans, and a modest increase among independents. To the point where now the public generally has more confidence in the press than it actually has in the president. And so, that offers at least some ray of hope, I think, for our profession. And I think over time we have to think back, for example, to Watergate, for example, when the approval of the press took a real beating. At the time, it was viewed as a partisan investigation on the part of the press and on the part of Democrats as well. And it turned out that the reporting was ultimately validated. And I think that we see a lot of attacks on the press today. The reporting of the press is viewed as strictly a partisan act. The president has tried to portray us as enemy of the people and the opposition party in an effort to disqualify us as an arbiter of fact. But I think over time, reporting has been and will continue to be validated. And that too will restore our trust. It's important for us to be careful in our reporting, to be accurate in our reporting, but also to be straightforward in our reporting, to tell people what we've really found and not to beat around the bush.
Craig, Seattle has been very, very successful with funded journalism with help of the Knight Foundation and others. And one of the McClatchy newspapers, the Fresno Bee, has launched some initiatives into funded journalism, into education and other things. Can you speak on that some?
Yeah, of course. And maybe the best way to organize our thoughts, just picking up on a very good editor, and there are a few of them up here, once said, we're not at war, we're just at work. I had pointed out in the first statement that if you put the customer first in a digital environment, really profoundly understand how your customers are changing, and transparency, as Marty pointed out, is one of the keys there. We, just as the Post and others have done, have launched transparency modules that are sidebars that explain much more depth about how we came to do our reporting, how it was that the material came together. That's one of the things in a digital environment that begins to build credibility. And we have to come back to what David mentioned. This isn't the first time in economic history that profound technological, sociological, environmental changes have led to big changes for businesses. The problem, and I state this more as someone who looks at things sometimes from an economic background, maybe it was no accident I started at the Wall Street Journal than necessarily solely a newsroom background. The challenge is for too long we didn't want to recognize that fact. And so as a result, if you focus on the elements of putting the customer first and being essential, the alternative funding that you mentioned, Pierre, comes as we explore with a variety of new entrants in the community. And in Fresno, this will help fund 4 reporters to cover education in the very deeply economically challenged Central Valley of California, where we got our start 162 years ago, to cover education in a way that we wouldn't easily be able to do if we simply had to derive it from operating expenses that we would otherwise put to work elsewhere. We also work with other organizations. We have a great partnership with ProPublica, which many of you know. We work with the Knight Foundation and Report for America in a variety of our regions. But I don't want to just suggest that that is either a panacea or a tremendous driver of the solution. It's a piece of it. And if we can use our time usefully together this morning, many of us have traveled from very far distances. What are some of the things that go into making a successful, essential digital product? Well, you need a technology platform that meets the quality of your journalism. In the case of the Post, I think it's one of the most remarkable technology transformations that has happened in this industry, largely powered by visionary engineering and development organizations that operate at scale across the globe. At McClatchy, we have actually standardized on a platform in the scale that we can, so that all 30 of our titles around the country are on a single digital platform, none of which could be afforded by any single title. Let me repeat that. None of which could be afforded by any single title. That means that unless you're owned by a billionaire proprietor, or you happen to, and we support the efforts that David has led us in to help change some of the terms of trade as we negotiate as an industry. Unless one of those two things happens, you have to look hard at how you're going to be able to develop that, which is a very, very challenging thing to do as a single proprietor, single-threaded institution. We've shifted our organization to a functional structure, common in Silicon Valley, but a great challenge to news organizations that have been commanded and controlled by strong newsroom leaders and a business side that sometimes was referred to as church and state. Now, I don't want to leave open the idea that that church-state divide doesn't matter. Of course it does, which is why these organizations have to be led by people who have a compass pointed at the true north of independent journalism in the public interest. But it means that your news department, when your news department asks you, why do clicks matter, you can say to them, as I have had to do, well, when I started at the Wall Street Journal double-digit years ago, people counted my bylines, they counted my page one stories, and they counted what we called majors, which in a vertical layout paper, no longer the case at the Journal, went across 2 columns and was a big story. And the only difference in 2019 with a digital general manager running the place is I have better data. Data and your understanding of the customer drives everything in this new world. So focus every day on being essential. I'll end with the definition that actually comes from Kristen and Mindy and our news leaders. What does essential really mean? It means fearless. It means credible. It means connected to your community. It means solutions-oriented, which is something we all should think about. And of course, in many of your communities, and I don't mean to diminish the diversity and the tremendous challenges that many of you face in the day-to-day work, and just pay tribute personally as a journalist to the incredible heroism that was represented in the award winners Friday night. And we feel it amazingly intensely at the Miami Herald and McClatchy as well, when our reporters are taken hostage in Venezuela, when we have to try to liberate Austin Tice, our stringer, Marty Stringer for the Washington Post, who's been incarcerated in Syria for more than 7 years. So I want you to know I don't say this as a gringo with no deep respect for how different and varied your communities are, but I think we do have to be solutions-oriented because a digital world demands that, and a new time demands that. And then finally, and you can probably tell it from the speed with which I speak, and I hope that the simultaneous translation can keep up with this, but in a daily environment, we have to be more urgent. A digital world does not live in a daily environment. And so we no longer call ourselves a newspaper company. We're an independent journalism company, a local journalism company that has dailies and operates 7 by 24, 365, and demand sometimes rises long after the print edition has gone to bed.
Well, what are your thoughts on, should we be trying harder to salvage some of the advertising revenue model? If advertising is going to an online model, and that online model is dominated by essentially 2 companies that are profiting off of the content that independent news companies, journalism companies pay a lot of money to produce, should we be looking for a share of a proportionate share of that revenue that we're not getting? Martin?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we can try. I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to turn back the clock. There are many ways that those tech platforms can avoid having to pay a carriage fee. They could just run headlines if they wanted to, and they've started to do that in countries where they've been threatened with a carriage fee. And so, I think that we have to do what Craig talked about, is that we have to think about the value that we're offering our readers. They have to be willing to pay for what we do. Yeah, it's true that if we actually have a pay model, not everybody's going to be able to read us. That was true when we had print editions. We actually asked people to pay for the physical newspaper, and that meant that not everybody was going to read us. I recall very distinctly when I was editor of the Miami Herald, watching some senior citizens look inside the box with the print newspaper and never put a quarter inside the box, to my great frustration, say, it's just a quarter, pay for it. And now I think that we need to offer value for people. What is it that's going to cause them to put their hand in their pocket and pay for what we do? I don't think that we're going to be able to, sure, we can try to get more out of the advertising market, and we should try to get more out of the advertising market, but ultimately we have to offer value to our consumers. And we need to think about what that is. And I think that clearly the challenge is greater for local newspapers than it is for national newspapers, which are covering Donald Trump and all sorts of other issues here in the United States. But I think we're already beginning to see elsewhere in the world some development of pay models elsewhere. So in Argentina, we've seen a number of the papers there, or news organizations there, that are beginning to get their readers to pay. And that's really encouraging. We've seen that in Brazil as well. And it's the beginning, it's not the end. There are a lot of challenges ahead. But at the Washington Post, we didn't have any subscribers in 2013 digitally. They were only subscribing to the print edition. And now we have, we don't announce it regularly, but as of the end of last year, we announced that we had surpassed 1.5 million digital subscribers, and we have continued to grow at a nice pace since then. And so I very much think that what has changed for the Washington Post is sure, everybody's referred to the rich guy who owns us, but we're not run as a charity, we're run as a business. The objective here is to create a sustainable business model. And the first thing that Bezos did after he acquired us was to change the strategy of the Washington Post. And so I think every news organization needs to really think through what is the strategy for our news organization and how do we get people to pay. When Bezos was interviewed a couple of years ago, he described our strategy as be riveting. That means do compelling journalism that causes people to want to read. Be right, make sure that our information is correct, and ask people to pay. They will. And I think it's important that our organizations begin to ask people to pay. Otherwise, they will expect that they will never have to pay. And that needs to change.
I just wanted to add on that I think there's a theme here that both Craig and Marty hit on that's really important, which is that in a certain amount of a way, news organizations just kind of need to get more flexible and nimble and scrappy. I mean, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing that we're forced to do that is sort of immaterial. I think, in some ways we have to get out of our own way and be more flexible and creative about how we're going to create value for people. I think a good example of that is the impeachment story, where I feel that what our audiences really probably want is just explanatory information about what's going on. But I know my own news organization keeps writing these stories in sort of a traditional way that's probably very dense and hard to understand. And so that sort of ongoing struggle that you're actually making yourself essential to your community, to your audience, to your readers, to your viewers, that you're actually looking at things. And I don't think that means lowering the journalism at all, but I do think it means sort of being more explanatory, obviously, more accessible. And we try to be, to this whole idea of creating value for our readers, what we're trying to do is make the AP more scrappy and more sort of like, out there covering news, even if we're not in a ideal environment to do that. And so if there's a good example of this is if there's some, urgent story going on, and you can get some video on your iPhone, that's probably just as valuable as if you have a big broadcast camera. And there's been a certain amount of, I think we're in an industry that likes perfect, and that sometimes our journalists like perfect. And a lot of this has been sort of cultural change to keep the standards, but say, be a little bit more scrappy and be a little bit more aggressive and not be as scared of the changes that are hitting our industry. And I just want to add one thing, which is that I do actually think the diversity issues that Craig raised are critical to this conversation, because there's a lot of people. When I was overseas recently, I met a woman who is one of our OPC fellows, and she's a woman of color who has just written a book about, I think it's about Saudi funding of religious institutions overseas. Brilliant person who I look at somebody like that and I'm like, you're the future of journalism for the AP. And yet my news organization is still not as diverse, even in terms of women, people of color, women of color across the spectrum. And I do actually think that the diversity issue is not a nice add-on. It is actually important to make sure that we're telling the types of stories that draw audience going forward. And so it's often talked about as kind of something we should do. I actually think commercially and in terms of gathering audience is actually critical. It's not sort of a thing we should do for our mission. It's a thing that we should do to make sure that we're actually gathering audience.
Thank you. I just want to clarify that point I was trying to make before is, at least from my perspective, I don't think there's a single answer. People want to have a single answer to our challenges if we just do this, right? And, reader revenue and subscription is critically important to everybody's strategy. And it's not just, the big coastal newspapers that people know about. Minneapolis Star-Tribune has done tremendous work in driving digital subscriptions, and it's critical to their efforts. And philanthropy and support from individuals of means is funding a lot of critically important things. What I try to caution against is, one, the idea that racing in one of those directions alone is the answer. I think what I see among my publishers is they're looking at every option on the table, and I'd encourage every publisher to do that. We also have been supporters of of a bill in Congress referred to as the Safe Harbor Bill that would allow news publishers to collectively negotiate with the major tech platforms about their contribution to that. And I don't shy away from viewing that as yet another important component of this. I've never argued that it is the answer or there's a magic part of money that would come from the sky from the platforms that would solve everybody's problem. But I'm also not willing to take it off the table. They are participants in our system of distribution, and I think they have certainly a critical role to play in helping sustain it economically. So I think all of these things are important, but too often I get a message of, if we just run in this one direction, that will be our answer. And I haven't seen that anywhere. People may have a different point of view, but that was the frame I was trying to convey.
Pierre, can I also expand on your question about advertising and its link to the changing business model? I do think we have to remember, and again, we pointed out earlier, this is not the first time industries have seen massive change. David talked about radio and television. There are many examples in technology, media, telecom. There are tremendous examples in transportation. In energy and fossil fuels, we're seeing it now. This is a fact of economic life for hundreds of years. I do think that part of the issue for the newspaper industry is that the tide went out quicker. And we were businesses, when Marty was the editor here in Miami, it was a business that was a bit over 80% advertising revenue driven. It's a mark of success at McClatchy that we're much closer to 50-50 subscriber revenue, advertising revenue nowadays. Because as Marty pointed out, what I think Jeff said in the change of strategy at the Washington Post was, I think I heard him say at one point, Marty, that it went from a strategy of being expensive for few people to less expensive for many people. And that's a very big strategic change For us, part of our scale gives us the ability to manage through that change. But again, the combination of McClatchy and Knight Ridder in 2006 was a $5.6 billion combination, the largest of its time, depending on the merger that is currently in process and up for shareholder vote at Gannett and New Media. I guess the shareholder vote next month, if those two businesses consolidate, will be the second largest, McClatchy will be the second largest local newspaper and news company again. And there will be some businesses at that scale that can have the digital technology to allow them to operate with the sophistication, data, consumer insights, et cetera, that allow you to have an advertising business that leverages those insights in the way that you have to do in a digital era. So whether it's bundled advertising with your daily and with your electronic products, or programmatic advertising based on data that you have that would never have been table stakes 10 years ago, those are the kinds of things that are required, I think, as we sort of head closer to the next decade than the decade we've been in. And again, I raise that because I think it's relevant for many of us in the room, regardless of what country we're in. Obviously, every country is different. But these basic driving forces of technology and consumer behavioral change, constant, always on, powerful devices, an ability to reach out and have alternative sources of information, fact or not, to Marty's point and to Sally's point. These are things that are unlikely to change. Regulatory environments may change for the better, and we thank David for his efforts on all of our behalves there. But the fundamental tectonic plate shifts of technology, communication, and the way that information flows because of those, that tide, unfortunately, we cannot, like King Canute, try to stop that tide. It's inexorable.
Yeah. Any other thoughts before we take some questions? Or do you want to open it up for some questions? Does anyone have any questions?
Hello, my name's Alejandro Aguirre, former president of the IPA here, and I'd like to thank you all for being here and for your wonderful insights. A couple of things, a bunch of things came to mind, but I'll narrow it down to two. I used to hear that our brands and brand equity was one of the biggest assets that we had, and I really believed that, and I don't mean to say that in an insulting way, but I hear you mentioned about, anybody who's under 40 and under 30 and under 20, how they use the media. So many people tell me, oh, I saw it on the internet. Oh, I saw it on the internet. And I ask them, but where did it come from? I don't know, I just saw it on the internet. Can you find it for me again? They can't find it again. And so it's telling me that sometimes they're finding things from that are coming out of your shops. I'm not sure if they're punching through. I'm not sure if they're spending a lot of time on it or just looking at it at some social media. Is the brand equity as important as we really think it is? And the data, the time that people are spending on our products as opposed to just, going all around the internet and looking at a bunch of other stuff. What is that data looking like for companies like yours?
I'll take the first crack at it. It's a very, very valid observation. Maybe the best way to approach it without being overly quantitative is what we would expect to be the case. When we do a series like Perversion of Justice here in Miami on Jeffrey Epstein and the Epstein case, 2 years of reporting, hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees supported by corporate to allow Julie Brown and Emily Michaud and Casey Frank and the rest of that team to do its work. That's the sort of thing that not only enhances the brand equity and value of the reporting and the reporting team, which is entirely justified, but of the Herald, its commitment to independent journalism in the public interest, and by extension, McClatchy. It also isn't something, although there have been terrific stories and interesting new development in the Times today, actually, Marty, I think it was in the Post. Yeah, sorry about that, in the Post today.
Thank you for the correction.
It is hard to keep up. And I think we have to recognize that, as David alluded to, the redistribution of information through social, through the expanded way that people get their information, does not necessarily constantly enhance our brands. I think the takeaway is it just makes it more important for us to focus on the core table stakes of being essential. And unfortunately, we are no longer getting all of those tailwinds of the centuries or decades of important investment in the brand equity. So our research shows the brand equity is profound, maybe even more profound in local in some respects than in national, where, how do I say this without jinxing it, where our ability to be profoundly of the place insulates us from some of the very difficult circumstances that Marty's team and others have found themselves in when they're involved in tussles over perceptions, as opposed to the nouns and verbs and facts that are explicated by the journalists and by the team, to whom I'd like to pay tribute. And so as a result, I think the thing I'd leave you with is there's no room for complacency. We cannot coast. The brand equity no longer gives us those tailwinds, so we have to kind of reacquire it all the time. And I think that's the big difference. Not that the brand equity isn't there, but it's less persistent and requires constant reinvestment, which is immensely fatiguing and requires incredible dedication on the part of our entire teams, led by the newsroom.
The only thing I would add is that I think that the ease of distribution or the ease of acquiring content for young people, we all see this in our day-to-day work, regardless of where we are in the industry. I don't know, seamless distribution, to me, is as high of a value as the strength of the journalism or the relevancy of the journalism. And so I think that there is brand equity, there is the actual product matters to people. There's just no question. And I think that in some weird ways, the tensions in the United States have added to that, the people look for credible information. But they also care about seamless distribution, really, really intensely. And so if you have a really great product and you don't, have a great tech platform, or you don't have a modern way to consume that information, I think you're kind of toast, basically. Because I think we see a lot of indications that seamless distribution is just as high of a value as good journalism. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think that's a real profound thing among consumers right now.
I think the brands are really important. They continue to be. Obviously, they face challenges over the years from the fact that people can get information wherever and whenever they wish to on the internet. But you see evidence of the strength of the brands in a lot of ways. I mean, I noticed that obviously when we write something that President Trump doesn't like, he attacks us and calls us fake news and fiction, as he did yesterday. But when we write something that actually he does like, that he feels can support his point of view, like the other day we had a fact checker on something that Adam Schiff, who's leading the impeachment inquiry, that he had made misstatements, that we gave him so-called 4 Pinocchios for that statement. And that got picked up everywhere by all the president's allies. So they know that if it appears in the Washington Post and we say it's not true, then they're going to take advantage of it. And that is a brand that they know will be accepted as that there's real reporting behind that. When we changed our strategy after the acquisition by Bezos, the brand was incredibly important. We changed our strategy to go to a national and international strategy. He said, look, you're in the nation's capital. You have the capacity to do this, to take advantage of the gifts of the internet, even though it's caused you tremendous pain. And the gift is of essentially free distribution, worldwide distribution. And you're in the nation's capital. You have the name, the Washington Post, which can be leveraged to a national level. And then importantly, he said, and you have a history and tradition that forms your identity. And we know who we are. The implication being, we did not need to go off to a retreat to figure out who we were. That history and tradition dates back to Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, all of that. A history and tradition of doing investigative journalism and shining light in the dark corners of government and other powerful institutions, of doing investigative work. And when we created a new app for a new tablet app and a mobile app, there were some people on our tech team who wanted to experiment, and he encouraged the experimentation. And many of them actually didn't want to, some of them proposed not using the name The Washington Post. And ultimately he said, no, that's what I bought. I bought the Washington Post. I want the Washington Post. That's what's important here. That brand is really important. And I think we have to understand, how long would it take for a new brand to achieve the recognition and reputation of the Washington Post? A very long time. And I think as we ponder what our strategy should be, we should not dismiss the strength of the brands that we have. Yes, we need the distribution system, we need the technology. We can't just have a great brand and then not be able to deliver the information when and where and how people would like to have that information. But the brand is still central, should be central to our strategy.
Yeah, if I could follow on with that, I completely agree. I think in the digital space, your brand is everything. You know, when I was growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my parents got the Pittsburgh Press, which doesn't exist anymore, by the way, but we didn't get the Houston Chronicle or the Honolulu Star Advertiser, because it turns out those guys didn't deliver to the South Hills of Pittsburgh. In a digital space, you can consume any of those things easily, just as easily. So your brand is almost all of your equity value, and reinvesting and creating and making sure you're delivering on the promise of that brand is, I don't think it could be more important in the digital space. One of the complaints I've had with the major platforms is they do, as noted in the question, often suppress the brand, which is not only bad for our business, it's bad for readers. You know, again, when we were growing up, the newspaper was a different thing than Walter Cronkite, was a different thing than Crazy Joe at the dinner table, right? Crazy Uncle Joe. And you knew those things came from three different sources with three different backgrounds of editorial support. Too often in the internet blender, those things are delivered to people all exactly the same way. And it puts a huge burden on readers and users to differentiate between crazy uncle conspiracy theory and high-quality journalism. And I think there's a need for anybody who delivers news online to think more deeply about that and to convey the origin and, frankly, to highlight brands rather than suppress them.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, if anybody has one. Yep.
Hi, my name is Emilio Sanchez from Spanish News EFE. This is a question for Martin, and it's not about the future of the news, it's about the big story of the moment, the impeachment. So I would like to know what kind of team are you going to have for covering the whole story? How many people are going to cover, for example, the relationship of Vice President Biden's son with Ukraine or China? How many people are going to cover the relationship or the business of President Trump's sons with different countries? And finally, is about a personal question for you. Do you think that the impeachment is going to help to President Trump to be reelected in 2020?
On the latter question, I don't know. I'm not a political pundit, and so I have no idea how it's going to play out, and I'm not sure anybody does. You know, in terms of the team, We probably already have at least 24 people who are working on this in our newsroom. I imagine that that will expand as necessary, depending on the nature of the story. People in almost every department, except maybe sports, are involved in our coverage of this subject. There are so many angles to pursue. It's not just our investigative team or our national team or our national security team or our politics team or our foreign staff, but all of them are deeply involved in this, and our feature staff is involved in it as well. And so I'm just estimating off the top of my head that we have 24 people involved in it. I don't really know. I've never done a count, but I imagine that that will grow over time and involve a huge portion of our newsroom.
Thank you. Thanks for a great discussion this morning. I'm Tony Peterson, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, also a past president of this organization. A number of you mentioned diversity, race, ethnic, gender. Incredibly important. Everybody in this room would agree to it. Our critics in the academy and your critics in media point to a lack of diversity of political thought and political affiliation. Is that important on the one level, and then should we be showing that as a part of our transparency to make sure that at least there is some diversity of political thought in our processes?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most important things in the United States in terms of political coverage is obviously, I think, gender diversity, it is obviously racial diversity, and I think those are actually, as an industry, we're not as strong on those as we would like, I think. But I also do actually think that in a place that, like the United States, geographic diversity, and as Marty sort of alluded to, socioeconomic diversity are just as important, because many of the fault lines in, for example, the United States specifically in political thought are, probably more rural-urban than they are anything else, okay? Because one of the big divides in the United States is the political opinions of people in rural communities and the political opinions of people in urban communities, even if they're not New York City, even if they're, regional cities that are, have jobs, basically. And I do think this is one of the big challenges to political coverage in the United States, is making sure, it's just not quite as strong to have even people who are very skilled go into a place for a while, because they're still sort of parachuting in and they're still going to not, understand that community as much. I mean, we are fighting very hard to keep our footprint of people in every state across the United States, and this is one of the reasons we're doing that, because it is a big, diverse, sprawling place. We get weird things where there was a situation that we had before the last election where one of our reporters was talking to some voters in Kentucky, and the person was railing against the mainstream media, and it happened to be a woman reporter, kind of raised her hand and said, I just need to tell you, in the interest of transparency, I work for the Associated Press, which is a national, international news organization. And the voter said, oh, I didn't mean you, honey. I didn't mean you, right? So I do think that the people think of news organizations as far away and elite and other, and that's one of the reasons why local news organizations have so much power, because there's more trust, because it's somebody who's in your community and knows you more, right? So we have, after the last election, we got really tired of the exit poll, because we thought the exit poll had a lot of really built-in problems with it. And one of these was that people don't go to polling stations anymore. They vote by phone, and so you're catching a very not representative group of people. And when you approach people one-on-one, it tends to change how many people you get answering your questions and things like that, and how they respond to you. And so we actually think there's a lot of strength in more online polling, even though it seems like that's a different sort of thing. People actually give more accurate answers if there's a little bit of impersonality in it. And so we sort of tore apart our whole exit poll operation and are starting to do what we hope long-term is a more accurate way to poll people in the United States that tries to get rid of some of these built-in political things that we've been struggling against with for many years. It was hard for us to do that because we're not a very rich organization, but I do think that trying to break apart some of the past ways that we have covered politics in the United States are incredibly important going forward. One of my big worries is that there was a lot of hand-wringing after the last election about polls and about East Coast journalists covering the country and not really understanding what people thought, and that a lot of that is still essentially sort of in place. So we're trying to address some of those issues. One of my big concerns this year also is making sure that we're actually not just covering impeachment, but that we're also covering the issues that people care about. We're told that at the town halls, there's a lot of conversations about healthcare. So I want to make sure that I've got journalism out there that local news organizations can use that is about things like what people think about healthcare.
It's a very good question, and I think by the question, maybe our most recent editorial writer in Fort Worth, who's a person of the right, I see you smiling, you may actually recognize who I'm talking about, sort of reflects our commitment to make sure that a variety of voices are on our opinion pages and that the person's profile is recognized in the community. And that's important. It's important in the Carolinas where we've hired a person of color, also on the right side of the political spectrum, a very unusual talent, but someone whose voice is already having big impact. And we announced recently an entire reorganization of the way we approach opinion because something has happened and we have to recognize it. In our work on our data, opinion drives subscription and deep connection to our titles. It drives brand equity in a way that's very powerful, and a way that's very different from a free-to-air model of just total page views and total traffic. So while it may not drive great breadth, it drives terrific depth, and that can be very valuable. You only can get that insight if you have the data that allows you to extract that insight. And so we've made a big investment in opinion, and that's the reflection of some of those recent recruited people that I'm referring to, and we're not done. And part of it also reflects that we learned opinion now for us, and I know our time is short, so I'll pull this all together. It has to be reported, and you're about to hear from Andres Oppenheimer, a perfect example of someone who on our opinion pages deeply reports his work. That's something that's characteristic not just or solely to McClatchy, but is deeply important in making sure that opinion doesn't just appear to be someone's view, but has a basis in fact. And it reminds me that at a place like McClatchy, a 162-year-old Northern California startup, or we like to think of ourselves that way, we stand on the shoulders of, like many people in this room, family ownership that has ensured a certain amount of independence. And that includes people whose last name was McClatchy and is McClatchy, but also Knight and Ritter and Daniels and many other people. And in fact, Marty, it's not just Bezos, but it's Graham and it's Meyer and it's other families. And the AP is the perfect example of standing on the shoulders of our predecessors. And I think that insight for many people here in the room is important. Family ownership can offer independence, but it can also offer a closed-mindedness of view that may not be an effective business strategy going forward, and we have to kind of continue to challenge ourselves. And now a personal note, so this is such a group of intergenerational family people. I'd just like to say in closing, my father used to attend this meeting in the 1960s. He was an editor and publisher at McGraw-Hill, and one of his magazines was called Ingeniera Internacionales Construcciones. So he actually came to the IAPA meetings in the 60s. I never went, I was a little kid. And I'd just like to say, Dad, you were right. I really should have studied Spanish harder, so apologies.
Thank you.
Edward, you have a question?
Edward Seaton, Seaton Newspapers. I'd like to raise a matter that I mentioned yesterday in my presentation, and that has to do with the fact that the social media platforms do not have liability for what they have on their platform, Facebook and so on. That exemption was created by the United States Congress in 1996 in the Communications Decency Act. That exemption could be reversed by the United States Congress. My question to all of you who are top leaders in our profession is there any possibility of getting the Congress to ensure that they provide, that they have liability? When a newspaper runs a comment, we are liable for it if there's libel. They are not. In my judgment, that should change. What do you think?
Thank you. Yeah, it's certainly a hotly debated topic in Washington. I was actually testifying at a congressional hearing, and I was asked about this, and I said, well, the business model now is we get the liability and they get the money attached to it, so that's kind of a good deal for them. I think what you're seeing is with a couple of bills that were passed, was it last year, SESTA and FOSTA, about human trafficking, there is a renewed debate about how expansive Section 230 should be. There's going to be another debate about opioid sales, and you could get in a very extensive discussion about the costs and benefits of Section 230. I think underlying is there's a desire to allow small companies to grow and then maybe reevaluate when companies get to a certain size. I'm not expecting any change in the near term. I think it's a kind of ongoing debate. For our industry, it's a particular disparity because, again, we are liable for what we say and don't always get the economic benefit on the other side. I don't know if anything's imminent, but certainly there's going to be continued discussion about it. I also wonder, for the most part, our properties do not benefit from Section 230, things like we do in terms of like comment sections, for example, if you have comments, but we also moderate those things. And so I don't have a clear answer for you other than people are going to keep talking about it, but I'm not expecting a big change anytime soon. So.
All right, thank you. I've been told we are out of time, so with that I would like to thank the four of you for your perspectives and insights, and thanks everyone for attending, and I'll turn it over to Ricardo.
Muchas gracias. Lamento ser el policía del tiempo y que ya me están odiando, pero a poco necesitamos ir completando una agenda. Llamo, por favor, a... We finish with this panel, so I just want David to stay with us because we'll continue with the copyright panel. Now, thank you. Les quiero comentar que ahora vamos a tener un panel con Martina Chevers, David Chavern y Eric Iriarte, a quien pedimos que nos